And understand, I'm sure most of you do, that I'll probably drop the terms Woodbury and Southbury interchangeably. Everybody recognizes, I would think, that at the time, in the colonial period, the town of Woodbury was much larger than it was now. Encompassed all of Southbury, big parts of Washington, Bethlehem, Roxbury, Middlebury also, I think, and even a little bit of Oxford, if I recall. So I'll talk about Woodbury as much as I can, but recognizing that's where we stand here today. It's common practice for people and for historians to focus on the military aspect of past wars. I like to look at these things in a broader sense to understand its impact upon the people and their involvement. So, but I can't overlook the initial part. Woodbury had a long history of involvement long before the actual conflict started. You can see in the town journals that at their town meetings they posted resolutions objecting to the Stamp Act, objecting to the Intolerance Acts. They posted resolutions in sympathy of the occupation of Charleston and Boston. So there was quite a bit of sensibility early on and quite a bit of support for what would become the patriotic movement. Not to say that there weren't some people who weren't completely taken along with this concept. I suppose every town had its share of Tories or loyalists. Fortunately, Southbury had very few, but of course they couldn't help but dig some up. There were a few people who were accused of being amicable, was the term, that is, speaking unfriendly of the cause. Fortunately, they were able to convince the Committee of Inspection that they were not that strongly in favor of enemy, and so they never suffered too much here in town the ramifications of such a charge, which is that you could have your firearms confiscated and perhaps even your property. I know it's hard to think that our founding fathers had laws infringing free speech and also firearms, but it's an interesting topic to run across those people, and some of them were relatives and neighbors of Ben Hinman who had varying opinions. When the conflict started, it's hard to tell exactly how many men dropped their tools in the field and marched off to meet the Boston Alarm, Lexington. Although there's plenty of stories, and we can find instances of individuals who just got up and left on their own and marched up to Boston, right here in town. Of course, there was various classes of soldiers. If you wanted to see what the contribution was here in Woodbury, you had many who left town would enlist in the regular army, and then of course you had the militia, which was the local people, to which every able-bodied man between 18 and 50, I believe it was at the time, was required to have a gun, was required to drill, was required to be called upon in the Minuteman fashion for the various different emergencies that came up. So it's easier to recognize maybe three-quarters of the citizen soldiers we had in terms of their militia involvement. But understand that Woodbury probably had representatives at nearly every battle between Maine and Yorktown, serving in various different regiments or in the regular army. You can run across 1,000 or more people who served, about 1/5 of the town, so it is claimed. And many I find who served in other capacities other than in strict military fashion. So just to review quick, oh yes, a good example of these are the boys from Roxbury, really natives of Woodbury, the Green Mountain Boys of Vermont. Remember Baker, Seth Warner, and Ethan Allen, responsible for one of the early victories, the capture of Ticonderoga, were truly natives of Woodbury, who moved on as pioneers. The militia. We'll hear about how the militia was called out, the 13th Regiment, the Woodbury Regiment, the local boys, also included New Milford and Bethlehem and other surrounding towns, but mostly Woodbury, marched off with Colonel Ben to Ticonderoga in one of the very first efforts in 1775 to support the capture of Ticonderoga. In the shadow of that, what is lesser known, there was also several companies that were sent off at the same time, concurrently, in August of the same year, to New London, which was being threatened by the HMS Rose, which you're familiar with the modern version of that ship. And then they went from there, from New London, up to join Washington's army in Boston, several regiments. The militia was called out again for the invasion of New York at Brooklyn Heights, which was, I think at the time, perhaps one of the largest armadas that had been invasion fleets by the British, resulted in the evacuation of New York. Woodbury men were called out in a Minuteman fashion to serve them. Many of them suffered greatly there. They followed through to 1776, the October Battle at White Plains, just north of New York. Again, they were hit very hard. Reports of several Woodbury people who served in the horrendous conditions in the British prison ships off of New York. Local people recall the story of the raid on Danbury. I've got some interesting insight to that later in my presentation. Of course, we're one day's march from Danbury when General Tryon went to burn the provisions. The people from Woodbury were there and present at the delaying action, which was the Battle of Ridgefield, which one of the men, probably here in the cemetery of Hinman, was wounded as Joel Hinman took a ball in his hip at about the same time that Worcester was taken down. We also see that they accompanied Israel Putnam at a raid on Horseneck, Greenwich. More about that later. The Woodbury boys spent a lot of time in Horseneck, which is on the coast at Greenwich, Coscob area now. We also had some representative, again, Hinman representatives who were President